All right, welcome back to the Jiu Jitsu Mindset. My name is Pete Deely, and I'm here with my professor, Professor Lucas Rubbo. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Peter. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, although I'm afraid I'm going to get my employee warning for not having sold enough coffee. I went 7 days, no sales, Professor. So I
I
don't.
think that's related on. I think that's related on how much you trained this week. You actually didn't train much, so man,
Yeah,
it can
guilty.
help that well.
Oh, guilty. And next week's even worse. I have to travel to San Francisco and it's
Oh
just
my.
yeah, my day job is getting in the way of my jiu-jitsu life. So, I'm almost considering it an emergency, really. And so as such, we've invited an emergency services professional to be with us today. And it is
There you go.
my fellow teammate, your student, one of my good friends that I got a chance to spend, time with here in the last 2.5 years and learn from and enjoy. And that's Mr. Omid Rahimi. So Omid, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Good morning, Mead.
So the title, right, of this podcast is Jiu Jitsu Mindset. And so we talk about jiu-jitsu as a preparatory activity for life off the mat, or a training to approach life differently off the mat. And so as we queue up the podcast, right, it's what happens on the mat affects what happens off the mat. However, the principles of the jiu-jitsu mindset are not owned entirely by jiu-jitsu, right? There are other places in the world in which, being comfortable while you're uncomfortable is both a requirement, because you have to be calm in these circumstances. And and there are other places, and truthfully, there are places in which it's more extreme, where the consequences of losing your concentration, of losing your cool, can be lethal. I have had the pleasure of hearing a lot about your background, Omid, and and you've done really, I think you must be 265, because I can't believe
My
how many
joints feel that way.
yeah, how many things you have covered in your lifetime. So we don't really want to go exhaustively through the list of all the things that you've done, but I would like to hear from you an example of a time in your life where where you were doing emergency services work, and if you could talk to us a little bit about what that meant, like what were the types of things that you were doing, and some of the consequences that if you or the people around you were not calm, were losing their minds in the midst of stress, if they were in uncomfortable situations, really uncomfortable, and there would be really dire consequences to both themselves and perhaps the people around them. Could you talk to us a little bit about things that you've been involved in that would fall into those categories?
Yeah, definitely. Just a short breakdown, or I spent a couple years early in my life in law enforcement. I worked for a sheriff's office, some in detentions and some on the road. And then I found firefighting. I spent nearly 10 years doing wildland firefighting, most of that with hotshot crews. I did some helicopter rappelling.
Right.
And then I went to a city department.
Mhm.
Like everybody knows, we call it the structure world. I was a firefighter on a fire truck for a couple of years. During that time, I also was an EMT. I was a wilderness EMT for years, backcountry medicine, and then on a fire truck. And also in all of that, I did other specialized duties. I was high angle search and rescue early in my life, so rock climbing, ropes, and then I did some extrication specialty when I was with the city department. So a lot of exposure to a lot of risk.
Yes.
You mentioned stress.
Right.
The jiu-jitsu saying of being comfortable in uncomfortable positions, it speaks truly to stress. That's what makes us all uncomfortable.
Right.
And in emergency services, you have to show up to help when people are at they're most stressed.
Right.
And we all know how being panicked or unsettled, it can be contagious.
Yes. Right.
So when we show up, we have to be the calm
Yeah.
in the storm.
Right.
And so it really mirrors jujitsu in so many ways. One is
well
go ahead.
before we get into the principles of it, because we want to explore that with some depth. But I mean, what you just described, rappelling, structural fires that you're pulling people out of, rescuing people out in the wilderness, I mean, rappelling, right? I mean, you just describe things that basically 99.99% of human beings on the planet, their knowledge and exposure to that comes to us from Hollywood. So these are theoretical things that you're saying to most of us. I've had my share of situations that I would consider stressful. However, I've never been in a situation where I was responsible for extricating somebody out of what would, absolutely be a lethal situation. So can you tell a story about one of these things that you were involved in which the stress levels were extraordinary and it required equally extraordinary control of how you felt? Could you take one of your probably million examples of things you've been in, and because you really laid out, like, in terms of everything non-military, this was you've covered you've covered lots and lots of ground where
there's a lot
civilian
there. And it's kind of funny because when you're in that, your bar for what is stressful completely changes, and so you kind of forget. So some of the war stories, I don't even consider them war stories. But one situation, so the key really is always being calm, being able to act, and being able to be safe.
Right.
So there was a time that I took a hand crew, it's 20 people, a firefighting crew, to Alaska. And there was a large fire that was threatening some cabins. And there were some guys that were scouting the area, and the fire made a push. The wind changed and was pushing this fire towards these two cabins. Mm-hmm. And they called on the radio, said, "Hey, we need some people to come in here." But it wasn't a safe situation. And so I said, being the leader of the crew, I would take myself and my assistant. We would go scout the situation, see if it'd be safe. So we jumped on an airboat and went down a river trying to get to this cabin. And we got to a place where it was so smoky, you couldn't see the bank of the river. And the guy driving the boat, it was a civilian guy. It was his own boat. And he said, "I'm not going any further. I don't feel safe here." And I knew through experience that it was still safe. The fire wasn't there. We had plenty of time. So there were two guys at this cabin.
Hey, Omid,
can I
ask you a detail about that? Just because this matters to me in other ways. Were you wearing something as you were at that point that was protecting your breath? Did you have something on your face that was protecting your smoke, or at this point are you still without some apparatus?
Yeah, good question. That's something I kind of take that for granted. In the wildland world, so that's forest fires to most people, you don't wear anything.
Okay.
There's no respiratory protection at all. Okay. So you're just eating smoke the entire time. I see commercials all the time about, do you have mesothelioma, right? I probably will one day. But no, there's nothing to protect you from that. You're just out there. You wear some Nomex clothing. So Nomex is fire resistive, but it's not fireproof.
Okay.
That's about it. So your mind and your safety checklist and your situational awareness are what keep you safe out there.
Right. Okay. So your breath you're breathing differently in this situation, because we often discuss the linkage, right, between breathing.
Yeah, I know where you're going. I know where you're going with this.
Great.
Yeah, exactly. So we get close. We can't even see the cabins. The two guys at the cabins start yelling.
Sure.
And they are trying to get a hold of us with whistles. So we know where they are. I can't see them. And the guy in the boat says, "I'm not taking you any closer." So it was like a scene out of a movie. Me and my assistant jump out of the boat into the river and just go to shore and make our way. And the guy in the boat takes off. So now we're on our own.
Oh my goodness.
So we find the cabin. It wasn't far, but we find the cabin and we tie in with these two guys. And we kind of get a rundown from them. And they said, this fire is making a push on us. We're talking to some air resources that are above it that could see the whole thing. And they're like, we're about to get isolated here and there's nowhere to go. The guy in the boat just left. So we had to make choices under duress of time. That's how I want to kind of tie this in. You have a limited amount of time to make a very important choice.
Right.
And you got to be calm doing it. So we had to decide, one, how safe are we going to be? Two, can we save this cabin? And in that span of time, we decided that we could do some work to try to save the cabin. So we chainsaws, moving stuff around that doesn't burn, preparing for this fire front to get to us, knowing that the only place that was really safe was the river.
Right.
So lo and behold, fast forward, the fire gets close to us, starts picking up, and this wall of fire leans over us, gets to the cabin.
Oh my God.
And it creates so much, like think of a campfire and how you see embers raise up. Now magnify that times a million.
Right.
So the heat of the fire was so intense and the air being sucked into it that the guy had a 14-foot aluminum boat. It picked it up. Just sucked it away.
Oh my gosh.
Stuck in our hard hats off our heads.
Whoa.
And we had to make a decision to get in the river. So we retreat into the river. And when the fire hits where the cabin is and close to the river, it has nothing to burn. So it obviously lays down. We kind of wait it out with our heads just barely sticking out of the water. It calms down after a few minutes. And now we have another decision, right? We can't just sit in the freezing water the whole time. So we get out, we go reevaluate, and we start finding little fires all around the cabins. So we start fighting fire with just hard hats full of water, digging with our Pulaskis, cutting things out with a chainsaw. And during this time, you can't save this shed over here that's burning to the ground.
Right.
You want to keep the cabin from burning. So we're trying to get fires out there. Radio traffic, nobody can come get us because the smoke of fire is so intense. There's no backup. It's just the four of us.
Right.
So we just decide to go to work, rely on our situational awareness, try to stay calm, and focus on the mission.
Right.
I think that's another tie-in with jiu-jitsu here is the focus on what's happening.
Yeah.
You don't have time for anything else. So we start this process, and then the fire turned. So it only burnt part of the forest that was right up to the cabin.
Right.
The fire turned and decided to burn the rest of it up to the other side of the cabin.
Okay.
And it came back to hit us again. So this time we were ready because we knew what to expect. So we jumped in the river.
All that because of like winding, changing directions.
Yeah, so it's really wild, and I'm going to keep it real short because you can go down the rabbit hole. But fire, I tell people, think of fire as water running down a hill. So when you pour water at the top of the hill, it's going to follow the crevices, and it's going to go really fast in steep parts, and it's going to go really slow on mellow parts. Fire does the exact opposite uphill. So fire is driven by topography, it's driven by wind, and it's driven by fuel, what it's burning. So it can come down one part, burn one half, and then create its own wind or get some wind from weather and get pushed another way and burn what wasn't, or follow a chute up a mountain. So it does crazy things like that. And it turned and came back at us. We had to jump in the river a second time, ride it out. Then we finally get out of the river, continue fighting fire. We save the cabin, we save the main shed, and then things clear up enough that they could bring in the reinforcement.
Wow. So
and this is just a funny little point. When they showed up and we finally got a chance to catch our breath,
right,
we were standing in one patch of green grass that wasn't burnt around these two cabins. And there was literally a deer, a bunch of rabbits, and some raccoons, because the animals had to come out of the woods, and we're all just standing there.
You have that raccoon crazy. Going, man, that was rough, guys.
Yeah. So that was, I mean, I hope I articulated the story, but talking about stress,
Yeah.
the
So
environment.
let me summarize what I heard just about. So first of all, like that boat captain could have used a little jujitsu, right? So that boat captain, the stress exceeded his ability to be calm in an uncomfortable situation. And by not having the ability to do that, he now leaves his group, the people who he's connected to, in a way that endangers them, because he has now taken away a resource to get you out of danger. And so when we talk about, preparation on the mat, off the mat, right? I mean, and I'm sure you had lots and lots of training for you to able to handle that level of stress, and that person it wasn't available to. However, had that person had similar training in some way, shape, or form, he or she could have been helpful to you. So the absence of being able to stay calm in a stressful situation removed the aid that really, you would have hoped would have stayed there with you. And in the story, you focus much on you and your partner, but then there are two other civilians, right? So the two other people who don't have a choice. So they're in a circumstance that they didn't pick, and you have no idea what their training is, and they may be like the guy on the boat. So when you talk about, like, okay, his panic on the boat, like, does not help you. Conversely, your training, your ability to stay calm extends to the people you are trying to take care of, because they now are safer, calmer, because you know what to do. We're going to go in the river. We're going to come out of the river. We can't stay in here. This fire is going in this direction. We need to behave in this manner in the face of these dangers. So your training didn't just keep yourself safe, but it extended beyond you and your partner to people around you. And in this instance, it could have easily have been lethal. So the training that you had, not just saved property, but likely saved lives. And I'm sure this is an example of things that you did over and over again. I mean, is that a fair kind of paraphrase of the story?
Yeah, it is. We use the term, we call it stress inoculation.
Yes.
And so it started in training, where you would get pushed, and normally it's physical,
right?
Because that's what is the easiest, most controllable stress you can put on a person, and it affects a person's mind.
Yes.
So that starts in training, and so stress starts with just physical fitness and getting pushed.
Yes.
And dealing with that. And then through fire specific stuff, you start dealing with training scenarios or prescribed fires or whatever, to have controlled stress, to get used to that. And then you build your own, we used to call it a slideshow. I don't know if anyone out there knows what slides is anymore, but through experience, you would build your own slideshow then, to rely on, oh, I was in a situation, I handled it this way, and it worked out, so I can continue that, or it didn't, so I had to learn something different.
Right.
And the stress inoculation can come in many different forms. And you kind of keyed on a thing I kind of forgot, but one of the guys there was the cabin owner, and he was the mellowest dude during this whole thing.
Wow.
And come to find out later, he spent his entire life living in the backwoods of Alaska as a professional trapper.
Wow.
And he was a professional wolf trapper.
Oh my goodness.
So he dealt with some crazy stuff himself.
Yeah.
And I believe that his lifestyle and his experiences gave him the stress inoculation. That when this got crazy, he was like, well, I've done some crazy stuff. Let's just deal with this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I believe that jiu-jitsu can do that for everybody.
Yeah, that's a terrific term, stress inoculation. And with I mean, this idea, I think, is present in so many lives, so many ways throughout our life. And as a father, thinking about my children, I always, when they were little, considered the notion of false danger, in that allowing them to, for example, climb a structure that would feel unsafe to them, to climb up something, but to allow them to do that rather than say, hey, be careful, come down, like to give them a threshold that they exceed of feeling stress. Because there's no way that the Omid prior to the training is able to behave the same way in that situation as you did.
Yeah, exactly.
And that can't happen immediately. It has to happen incrementally, right? So there's a rock climber named, I think Alex Hornby. I mean, his last name, I think I'm saying his last name right? But Alex is one of the greatest rock climbers on the planet. And he can climb up El Capitan with no ropes, no nothing.
Free solo, right?
Free solo. He's like an ant. This guy can go. And I was talking to another rock climber about like how extraordinary that was and how impossible. And he responded to me. He says, "Look, Pete, we start on the boulder and, we get comfortable to a certain extent. And then we slowly expand our level of tolerance for being at certain heights, certain types of grips until it doesn't, it's a process and it takes time." I would imagine that you achieve that level of calm and clarity through incremental training over time, in which you were increasingly under safe but higher levels of stress. It's one thing, okay, got to run a mile under a certain time. That's the type of stress. Maybe you're under a burning building that's controlled, but that's a level of safety that wouldn't exist out in the streets. I mean, is that a fair assessment? I mean, to kind of incrementally train yourself to get there?
Yeah, that's the only way.
Yeah.
One, you have to be safe, especially when you're dealing with these kinds of environments. Emergency services, you're getting called because there's usually a life-threatening or property-threatening thing going on, and so there's a high likelihood of injury or death. So there's a very small window of safety. So you can't train at the extreme,
right?
Because you could die.
Right.
And you got to be around to take care of the job. So it has to be in increments. It has to be controlled. And as you build up that tolerance, you can do more and more. And what happens is you don't think about the stressor anymore. It allows you to think about what's actually happening around you. And just like in jiu-jitsu, when you first start,
yes,
and you can't catch your breath, you're not thinking about jiu-jitsu at all.
Yes.
It takes time to be comfortable getting smashed in mounts,
right?
And not thinking about that, to then go, oh, I can catch his leg, I can trap his arm, I can sweep him.
Yeah.
So, but you can't do that right away. And it's the same, emergency services, jiu-jitsu, exactly the same that way. You can't take a rookie who's never been exposed to anything and throw him in the middle of a fire and say, you're going to be just fine.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from training. And another thing that popped into my mind is mentorship. I remember specifically one time we were on a fire. I was first or second year on the hotshot crew. We were doing a night burnout. And so that's when you put fire on the ground to burn up fuel so that the fire coming has nothing to burn. And sometimes that could be a little sketchy because you're trying to fight this time window again. So we're doing this big night burn, start the burnout, winds pick up, fire picks up, our own fire picks up. And it's, we call it torching the trees. But when you got 100-foot trees that are burning and now you got 200-foot flames and there's just a wall of fire. Yes. I remember the first time I saw that, and your natural instinct is like, I got to get away from this thing.
Yeah, right.
So I'm like, is this okay? Like, I don't have the mental slides or training. I read about it in a book, but I've never seen it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is going on? And there was this guy, and I'm going to give him a little shout out. He'll never hear this, but his name is Mark Howerton. We called him Meat Hook.
Okay.
When I was on the hotshot crew, he was 57 or something like that.
A young man.
Yeah, yes. He was a warrior. He served time. He was a ranger in Vietnam.
Oh my goodness.
Been through some crazy stuff. And I remember looking at Meat Hook, and he looked at me and smiled. And he goes, do what I do. He's like, we're okay until you see me run. That just and I'll never forget it, because I had this moment where I was like, oh, this guy had been through this. He knows, he has all those mental slides, all that training, all that experience. And so he's saying to me, and that's part of learning, is you got to have these mentors. That's kind of where I'm going with this. And that's where I see the upper belts in jiu-jitsu.
Yes, right.
And kind of my role, I'm a new purple belt, but kind of my role to the younger guys, what I find myself saying all the time is, trust the process. You can't fast forward it.
Right.
And work on being calm. It's not so much about your jiu-jitsu technique,
Yes.
but it's about being comfortable on the mats.
Yes.
And when I had this mentor teach me that, then that put that mental slide in for me. And I'm like, okay, this situation is okay. And I can trust this guy. Now I'm carrying that with me.
Yes, right.
And I feel that port's exactly over.
I love when we can have this type of situations, right, in relationships, when you can bond to someone through a stressful situation, which that's usually how it happens, right? Like in jiu-jitsu, we have this brotherhood that comes on the mat, on that sweat and hard training and everything. And people in law enforcement, they always say the same thing, right? Sometimes after they stop to work with that, and then they fulfill this again in the jiu-jitsu mats. But is what is really nice to see is that the training that brings that confidence, right? The training that bring you the awareness. So for everything that we're talking here today, Omid, I'm like quiet and imagine like a movie, right? Like I'm trying to understand and picture everything that you're saying. But every time that you talk about this, I'm focused on the problem, right? I'm focused on like, okay, the fire, where I go. But because I don't have the training to do that, right? And when Peter, you mentioned Alex, like I love to watch his documentaries, and climbing just like blow my mind. Those guys doing that. You know, when you see them talk, it's like, man, they're so calm, right? Like how it's literally is one mistake and he's done, right? Like one of them was talking once, the difference between like free solo rock climbing, like El Capitan and things like that, is a difference on, is it such a high level, is like you'll be able to go to Olympic Games, and if you don't get gold, you'll die. It's like that, you know, you need to be so precise on everything. But they understand the rock, right? I just see that as a crazy risk and super entertainment to watch. But then they're reading the rock, they're reading the past, so it's kind of like safe. For the more crazy that it sounds, safe. But why? Because of the training, because they understand the environment, they're aware about everything, right? And same thing with you, Omid, on those situations, right? You maybe someone will freak out at the first, but then you know, like, okay, I have this space over there, I have this, probably gonna happen. You can anticipate things, which we also do on the mats. When you see jiu-jitsu at the first time, it's like, looks like two bears fighting for a salmon. And then over time, you see 10 steps ahead, and you're more predictable. You start to understand things. So that's pretty cool.
In your preparation leading into this time of your life, Omid, one of the things that I'm interested in is if you had trained, and my sense of it is that you were an athlete as a kid and all of that, but I'm curious if you had trained jiu-jitsu before you entered those situations, do you think it would have had an impact on how quickly you assimilated the skills and the knowledge you needed to be, a safe and effective emergency services professional?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that a little bit. My whole life, I've been training or working out. I started wrestling when I was 5 years old, played football, track, got into powerlifting. And then when you get into the emergency services, physical fitness is such a huge part of that. So I naturally gravitated towards that, loved training, loved pushing, trying to be at the highest levels possible. I think what jiu-jitsu brings is a sense of confidence in a stressful situation that, again, it allows you to deal with the situation and not the stress. And I think as a young man, that in a roundabout way, it teaches you patience.
Yes.
And I think as a young man, with an alpha attitude and kind of high strung and wanting to perform at a high level, you're kind of wound tight.
Right.
And having patience earlier, I think, would have led me to learn some things faster without the school of hard knocks necessarily.
Sure.
I think that's something that jiu-jitsu, especially in young men, can bring to the table is this, it kills your ego.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
ego gets in the way of learning a lot of things.
Yeah, because for those of you who can't see Omid or don't know him or can't catch any of our videos, in addition to being devastatingly handsome, he's a big, strong man, right? Like he's not a little guy. He's got big muscles. And I'm guessing, Omid, as you were a 5-year-old, you probably had a natural strength, at least parity or advantage, more often than not. And so when you're in football, same thing, right? And so one of my experiences in jiu-jitsu was having had some physical altercations in my life. I never, the only time I lost those altercations when it was me against more than one human being. So my like confidence in like, oh, I can handle myself was destroyed in a very short amount of time. When the most like obvious moment was very early, like within it, I have Brett's got me in our gym and I realized I can't do anything. And I was over 50. I'd gone my whole life and I had never been dominated physically by another person, where I realized if this was not a safe situation, if I was fighting this person on the street, I would be like completely at his mercy. So one thing that that when I think about you, that jiu-jitsu might have given you, is that you probably were always in sort of a winning position, or in the winning position most of the time in those things you did. But if you were a white belt at 14 or 8 or 17, you would have experienced like where your training partner would have been more skilled than you, and you might not have had that ever before. And I don't know if that's fair to say.
That is totally fair to say. I've always kind of excelled in the physical side of things.
Sure.
I've always carried myself in a manner, I'm very confident. I've handled myself in situations
Sure.
quite well. But I think that's a false confidence.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of those wins is just bravado. It's just puffing up. You think that you're tough or strong or whatever this is. But sometimes you react because you have that false idea. Oh, I can handle this situation. And you get yourself into something that you shouldn't. And we can talk about altercations or emergency things. But jiu-jitsu, like we always like to say, the mats don't lie.
Right.
One of the most humbling experiences of my life was rolling with Big Mike.
Yeah.
And one time he had me in close guard and he decided he wanted my arm and was going to take my back. And there was nothing I could do about it.
Yes.
And I had never had that feeling.
Right.
Complete, like another human being has complete control of me and there is nothing I can do about it. That was the most foreign feeling to me. But it was very eye-opening of, okay, now I see who I am for real, my strengths, my weaknesses. That then affects, okay, I want to learn how to never get in that position again.
Right.
But also, I'm also not Superman.
Right.
I'm not going to just dominate people, and being as strong as I am, that is a strength, but that isn't everything.
Right.
And being exposed that early in life, I think would set you up for being able to learn better and having better relationships with people.
Yeah.
And avoiding conflict, avoiding it. Not giving you a tool to do it.
I consider that very wise. And I'm older than Omid, but I would say Omid is not a kid. He's not like, so
I'm 46, Omid, Peter. I'm going to catch you one day.
Yeah. So I think, in the Jewish tradition, adolescence actually ends at 40. So he's like, you're full grown. But when you say that, I had that same experience, and I immediately, it was interesting because I immediately changed in that moment where I was able to say to myself, okay, all this nonsense in your head about any circumstance with any person, you know, you're going to be able to be okay. And in some senses, it took away like a false confidence that I had, but it was a more honest relationship to the world. One of the things that I'm curious about is that couldn't have happened to the 24-year-old Pete. The 24-year-old Pete, if I got in that same situation, it would have taken me, I would have had to have been in that situation 20 or 40 or 50 times to realize, okay, look, up against a stronger, more skilled opponent, I am, you know, other than luck, other than something happening that is just, you know, an accident, I am outmatched. And that would have taken me, I would have had to have had that experience of being dominated, you know, over and over again before it would have like sunk into my consciousness. Whereas over 50, it was like an epiphany, right? As soon as it happened, I realized, okay, look, I could do this 100 times with Brett. The outcome is going to be the same. Like, I am not strong enough, skilled enough to deal with this person. He's the teacher, I'm the student. But because of my age, I was able to relax about that and not see that as like a diminishment of me as a human being. Like, well, there's something wrong with me. Instead, I was able to say, this is a great opportunity. Like, I have somebody who is willing to train me, who is, you know, better, stronger, you know, all that stuff. And I saw it as a blessing. And then it also, I'm not a conflict seeking person. I do not like physical altercations. I don't seek them. I avoid them. My pride has no issue with just, you know, getting myself out of all of that. Whatever things have happened to me were things that I had no choice about. However, I have no interest, no desire to seek anything out there in the world that's kind of conflict oriented, from a physical perspective. So I'm just curious. I mean, being, you know, with Big Mike, big, strong guy, skilled guy, does the 20-year-old Omid react to the same thing or same way that the 40-plus-year-old Omid reacts to, or would you have been similar?
I mean, that's a
about that?
great. No, I think it's just the nature of growing. So you say age, but we can substitute age with the word experience.
Yes, right.
Your life experience has taught you that when I hit a wall, instead of hitting that wall 40 times, I'm going to stop and take a look at it and be like, how do I go around this wall?
Right.
So 20-year-old Omid would have hit that wall 100 times.
That's
before on his own he figured out how to go around.
That's what I was going to say. I think it's more related to life experience than age, because you can still see a ton of 50 years old trying to do hitting the wall all the time.
Exactly. And I think so that's another unique, that's a great point, Professor, is 20-year-old Omid was a young man just trying to figure things out. 25-year-old Omid had already spent a couple of years in law enforcement and fire. Right. 30-year-old Omid, more, right? I think the vast majority of people out there, just like you mentioned, have no idea when I tell a story about a fire. They're envisioning the movie. They don't understand it.
Right.
I believe our society nowadays, people in general, do not get exposed to stress to then learn how to deal. And that could be anything from school, work, relationships. That's the unique thing that jiu-jitsu can bring to anybody, is this ability to face some stress in a controlled environment, have the built-in mentorship of upper belts that have that experience, that can impart the knowledge, and then you get to put the experience on the mats, learning where your bar is for stress inoculation, learning that, this was a bad situation. And if you're a young man, you might have to get smashed 100 times on the mat before you figure that out. But like Professor said, you could be 20 or 50. Sure. You know, we've had plenty of former athletes come to our gym, grown men who have always excelled, and then they hit that wall because they've never been challenged before. It teaches you all of those things. And so in the emergency services, I think jiu-jitsu as a young person will teach you that there is a process.
Yes, right. I have never been so bad at a physical thing in my entire life as like I have never had a less of an ability to like understand how to move my body, where my body is in space. I mean, in addition to just being dominated by other people, my inability to connect my brain and my body has been like, I don't want to say humiliating because that's too strong of an expression, but it has been clarifying. And that's for me, that's one of the pleasures, is that it seemed impossible. My first month there, I was like, I'm never, ever going to learn anything. Like, I'm just going to come in here and the professor is going to be like, you know what, you're the only white belt to take 6 years to get your first stripe because you don't learn anything. So professor, I mean, I'm curious because you start your jiu-jitsu journey at 13. And there's no way to expect a level of maturity for a 13-year-old as a teenager. So because you were so young, I mean, how long was the arc between now you were rolling with adults right out of the gate. So you were sort of in the jiu-jitsu equivalent of the 200 wall of fire, because you're a kid with adults, and it's early in the jiu-jitsu development, at least from a commercial, so there is no champions, whatever. It's like, come on in, you train with the big guys, and if we kill you, well, that's just part of the thing. So did you have a similar thing of having to, was it years? Was it a decade of having to develop the same humility? And if you went through that process, did your learning accelerate once you're like, okay, look, these are the people or did that get in your way for a long time? Like, I should be able to.
I think, Peter, I think the difference was my very first victory in jiu-jitsu was, I don't know, like a year after I started training.
Yeah.
I never had, I mean, I didn't have like small victories through the process because, like you said, I was like 13 years old, training with the adults in 2003.
Right.
Jiu-jitsu was different than it is right now. Like, the type of mindset on the mat was different. Like, same values, of course, but
right.
It was like, it didn't have much that hey, you're gonna have a stripe after your first month. I never got a stripe. Yeah. I got like, I got 4 stripes in a row on my white belt after I won the state championship, and a month later I got my blue belt. So it's like, was no like small rewards for
right. Yes.
on what I was doing. So for all the friends that we started together, we already had a friend doing jiu-jitsu, and he was the one that brought me into it. He was orange belt, right, since we were kids, so it's a different belt system. He already, like, for those who doesn't know about it, almost 4 years ahead than me in jiu-jitsu, right?
Okay.
And then we went there with a group of friends. I was the only one that stayed. All my other friends like didn't like it, but because, like, you guys know, you have no idea what's happening on the beginning.
Sure.
And he's constantly being smashed, being submitted, being smashed, being submitted, being manhandled, being everything, right? I decided to stay, but like staying and training and staying and training and tapping thousands of times every day.
Yeah.
In 6 months of training, I catch my friend.
Right.
Catching a way that, okay, he's not submitting me anymore.
Right.
Okay. And now, after a couple other months, okay, now the training's tight. No one is submitting each other, but now I'm winning by points or something like that, more dominant positions than he's winning me. And when I was getting to a point where I was tapping out, he quit. He stopped. and he never trained ever since. So until nowadays, we talk once in a while, and he's like, oh, you're a black belt and you have your school, your professor, but you never submitted me. So it's still he still talks about that.
Yeah.
But I'm going back to Brazil in 2 weeks, so let's see.
Yeah.
If I can find him somewhere. Peter, I think it took a long time. Like, it took a long time. Of course, I didn't realize because you're a kid.
Sure.
But I just stick with, I was having fun being there.
Yes.
Like when Omid was saying on that crazy fire that he looked at the guy, the 57 years old, and in other words, you felt safe, right? Omid, having him there and like, okay, I'm gonna mimic whatever this guy's doing. I was doing that with the higher ranks, you know.
Right. Yes.
I was like, man, that looks cool. That looks cool. So I was like, whatever they're doing, I'm gonna try to do and just try to become their shadow. And I think that was when I started to get more jiu-jitsu maturity.
And so, Omid, I mean, one of the things that I hear is a theme between sort of, you know, being 13, training with adults, right? Like those adults are in some senses, they're not as dangerous as those fires, but there's something that like you have to respect, you have to be careful with, otherwise you can get hurt. When I listen to those ideas, the word that comes to mind is humility. Like at this juncture in my life, like I consider myself very humble because I know that like things that I've done well in my life, there was circumstances, there were lots of things that were happening at the same time that weren't just a function of my intelligence or my physical ability. Like I understand that like my successes, you know, live in the context of things that I didn't control. And conversely, my failures, of which there are many, 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 also weren't a function of my lack of discipline or intelligence or whatever. So it gives me a way to be a little more flexible in my approach to my life, in which when things go well, I try to be grateful for, you know, doing my part, but recognize that it sits within other things that I can't control. And then when I fail, to try to have a little bit of gentleness with myself that goes, you know, you can do your best and not achieve the outcome. So when I listen to you guys tell these stories, then you both have extraordinary arcs of things you've done, right? I mean, going from a 13-year-old kid in Brazil, becoming a black belt, you know, running one of the most successful, you know, schools in the state, in the country, being able to describe positions left-handed, right-handed in your non-native language. I mean, that's a long, amazing arc. You know, Omid, there's probably a list of people who are alive today that wouldn't otherwise be alive if you had not had a level of stress inoculation that you had, where, you know, you were the meat hook to somebody else, and, you know, that you passed on that thing. And when I, you know, when I come into our school and I see the kids, and for the parents listening, when you're considering jiu-jitsu as an option, I see it as a way to create false danger. You know, they come in and you will feel stressful as a kid, and you'll feel uncomfortable, but you're safe. And out of that stressful situation with the people around you, one, you'll become incrementally more confident, and that you'll build a different type of relationship. Because how else do you get a shared stress relationship that's safe, where you can build friendships in that context in almost any other way? And in having boxed and having done karate and done striking sort of martial arts, for me, that was a different experience than jiu-jitsu. So, you know, Omid, as you think about, because I'm going to take us towards the end of this podcast here, I'm curious about two things. One, we want people to stay in jiu-jitsu or to try jiu-jitsu. So I'm curious about either adults or parents thinking about their kids, sort of the values that you see jiu-jitsu gave you to stress inoculate yourself. And then secondly, for the adults, there may be people who are listening that were in the military or in law enforcement, in the emergency services, and they had many years of living through these stressful environments with people who understood what it means to be. If you haven't fought a fire, you don't know what it's like to fight a fire. I don't care how good your imagination is. You don't know what that's like. If someone is dying and you're saving that person from dying, you don't know what that's like if you haven't been it. Conversely, people who have done those things have a bond with each other, because when you talk, you know, you have the respect with each other that, hey, you were in that situation and I was in that situation. And even if they weren't identical, you share something. Now, when you leave those environments, that might create a hole in your life that, you know, you could be ironically painful. Like, it's on some level probably nice not to have your life threatened as a part of your, economic and professional life. However, now you're no longer around day in and day out people who understand the stress, the PTSD that may be associated with it. So can you talk a little bit about those two things? I realize they're very different, but I want to get them in before we have to.
I keep circling back to, you use the word humility is what jujitsu is teaching you. And I was thinking about this a little bit, that during my years in fire law enforcement, there was always this situation where somebody went to college, got a degree in fire science or police science or whatever, went on some ride-alongs, went to the academy, whatever, gained a lot of knowledge, but they had no experience.
Right.
And we would always have, you cannot substitute experience with knowledge. You can gain knowledge from experience, but you can't always gain experience from knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was thinking how this ties into jujitsu, especially in my journey. But I believe that if you start jujitsu as a young person in your teens,
right,
you will learn a lot of these life lessons.
Yes.
Humility, dealing with pressure, dealing with adversity, learning. Like, jujitsu is a long process. It's years and years, and you can't push a fast forward button.
Yeah.
You can watch all the videos and gain all the knowledge you want. Right. Yeah. But until you put your time on the mats, you aren't going to learn these lessons.
Right.
And if you can learn these lessons early in life, when you become a 24-year-old police officer, firefighter, you join the military, you're already a step ahead on the stress inoculation.
Yeah, nice.
You already gained a lot of that. And so now when you're dealing with it, you're looking at it from an experience perspective.
Correct.
It carries over. And I was thinking about my jiu-jitsu journey, because I didn't start jiu-jitsu till I was 42, I think.
Right.
I had all that life experience. So when I'm getting pounded on the mats and dealing with that stress, I'm leaning on all the years of experience of, hey, this is going to lead to something. Hey, you just have to endure this. Hey, this guy knows more than you. Don't pretend you know more.
Right.
Like, I have that life experience that really is helping my jiu-jitsu journey now.
Makes sense.
And I think that's what jiu-jitsu can bring, especially to like emergency services people.
Okay.
So that's the first part.
Yes.
The second part, why I started jiu-jitsu so late.
Right.
And what it's done for me. So I left the fire service to be a stay-at-home dad. I happened to be in a family situation that was the best thing for our family. And I left my career to raise my child, which I don't regret for a minute. But like you mentioned, you leave an exciting, adrenaline-filled job. You leave a camaraderie and a brotherhood that only comes from experiencing really stressful things, and that shared experience builds those bonds. And then the driven part of working hard to be better at what you do, to be a professional. I always wanted to be the best firefighter I could be, the best sheriff's deputy I could be, whatever that was. And when I left that, there's a huge void. I mean, I was the best diaper changer you ever saw.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't very stressful.
Right.
It was like that movie, Vin Diesel is a babysitter or something. Like, his time in the diaper changers.
Yes. No, literally, it was like that for a little while because I needed that motivation. But I found jiu-jitsu, and I'm learning that it has all of those shared experiences that the emergency services had for me.
Yes.
It has the stress. It has the getting better yourself. It has the shared experience on the mats. You are sweating and bleeding and winning and losing and learning with the same guys. Over time. You build those strong bonds. You build that community. So you're getting better physically. You're getting better mentally. You're building great relationships.
Right.
It fills that role of my fire crew, of my hotshot crew. It fills that role.
Yeah.
And it leaves, it fills an empty spot.
Right.
And that's important, especially for guys who have left fire.
Yes.
And military.
Right.
I think that's a big part of the the, I'm going to say stress, but that's a big part of the depression that comes with leaving those careers.
Right. And I have an opinion about that, like the depression stems from the lack of community, the isolation. And so like being able to share something that's similar and unique in a certain sense. And the reason why training works, you're in a safe, you're in a controlled burn. And the reason why that works is that your brain, your body experiences the stress, even though the circumstances are safer than it appears. And so when you go and you train in jiu-jitsu, even though you're not in an actual fight, your brain and body are like, I'm in a fight. And the reason why you're exhausted and the reason why you can't think straight is that you're experiencing stress that actually isn't there. Now, and the professor, and I'm so grateful for that, creates an environment in our school. And when you go, listener, to your first class, you need to spend some time and see the ethic of the school, to make sure that it's similar to how Professor Rubbo runs our school, which is that, safety first. Yes, we train hard and all the rest of it, but we have great respect for each other and we don't push beyond something where people get hurt. And that, so anyway, your brain and your body are experiencing a stress that actually isn't there. You're not actually going to get your arm broken. You're not actually going to get choked to death. However, you're experiencing that. And that, if you've been in those real circumstances, but then you replace it with something, with jiu-jitsu per se, I think you can have a similar level of camaraderie with, hey, you know what, we train hard. I got tapped out, 200 times here. All of us, I don't care who you are, you're going to roll with somebody. I don't care if you're a black belt, there'll be some other black belt that comes in, and everybody's going to have their time when they're not able to win, so to speak. And we use that expression, you either win or learn, right? But so Professor, I just want to say, thank you in terms of, the circumstances you've created for me, and I think for Omid to experience that, because it's led
Definitely.
to, relationships. And Omid, I'm grateful for you being in my life. And one of the things that I find very attractive about you is that I like human beings that have a lot of amplitude to them. And what I mean by that is you've been out there saving lives, being in danger, and you carry with you all of that. And you also are the guy who have stayed home and kept, home life, that having all of that, huge amplitude of life experience, I think makes you extremely interesting. I think you have a level of compassion and wisdom that you couldn't earn otherwise. And that, when you're a training
My wife
partner,
would say otherwise, Peter.
yeah, well, I'm not saying you can't be stubborn and stupid, because I'm sure I'm sure all of our spouses might say that there are times when we are all that. But in addition to whatever foibles we may have, I just, I'm really grateful to be your friend, because when I'm around you, all of those, deep, interesting, rich life experiences are a part of who you are. So when I think about kids, I think about, giving them things that will stay with them their whole lives. I always like sports and music and things that force them into cultivating parts of them that they wouldn't. Some people are naturals, but most of us aren't naturals at things. We have to be exposed to that. And you're a person that put themselves in all these things to grow who you are as a person. I think we could talk to you an awfully long time, Professor. Before we head into kind of the end here, anything else you want to kind of ask Omid before we come to the end?
Man, no, I mean, well, Omid and I, since we started have our relationship as a professor and student, we became friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great friends. So those last 4 years and a half, we've been in each other's life pretty much every day. If not seeing each other, training, jiu-jitsu, lifting weights, riding motorcycles, talk over the phone, traveling, whatever it is, you just name it. So we do have a lot of questions. I can, a lot of stories that I would like to share if you had more time. But definitely what I want to say here as a professor, okay, for both of you guys, when you were a student, we always give like all the credit as possible to the professor, right? So constantly here, and I appreciate that a lot. Of course, you guys, I thank you so much for this. Thank you for that. Thank you for open doors. Thank you for teaching, whatever it is. But sometimes you don't realize that those things, what we do is we are building relationships, right? And the relationships in both ways. I can only do what I do because I have people like you guys with me, so following you guys' example on different type of lifestyles. But this, what you guys tell me every day, what I see you guys doing, because I observe a lot, you guys are helping me to mold who I am on the same way that I'm helping you guys make with your jiu-jitsu. But we are constantly learning from each other,
Yes.
And once you understand that it's not about one person, it's about the team, it's about the community. Things are just easier. They're fun. They're fulfilled. They give a purpose. They give everything else. So I just want to exchange the thank you to you guys, to make the community is great because people like you guys. And Omid, thank you so much for making the time to be here. Hope we can do this more often. For those that are listening to us, thank you. And guys, keep training. If you don't train, I don't understand yet why you didn't start. So just go.
All right, Omid, thank you very much. For our listeners, this is Omid Rahimi, and if you want to come down and train with him, we're in Chandler, Arizona at Ocotillo Gracie Barra, and we have now a sister school down in Queen Creek. So if you're listening to us locally, we hope to see you on the mats with us. Omid's rocking a pretty ferocious beard nowadays, so look for a big, strong guy with an awesome beard. My business friends continue to harass me for being an ineffective marketer. So let me conclude the podcast by you can see these videos. We do little clips of these podcasts at wellrunlife.com. Presumably you're listening to us on wherever you get your podcasts. We've been trending quite nicely. NYC Podcasters, actually, we were a staff pick. Thank you to NYC Podcasters. And for whatever reason, New Zealand loves us. We're number 83 in all the sports categories. So to our Kiwis out there, we are grateful for you listening, and we hope that you continue to stay with us.
We're going to talk about rugby next week, just because of New Zealand.
Exactly. Hey, you know what? We need to find a rugby player. I think that would be fun. I think we have rugby players. One here. Oh, excellent. Yeah. Okay. I think Ronnie's a rugby player. And then we need 24 subscribers. We have 3. So, hey, Jeremy and Cheyette, you guys have purchased coffee. Once you subscribe, a Well-Run Life gear is where you can find that. And please help us get to the 24 subscribers. We don't need a ton, but to underwrite the podcast, we need to get 24 people subscribing. So again, gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll be back next week, and maybe down the road, we'll do this again and catch some more stories. But thank you very much.
Yeah, guys, I appreciate you having me on. It's fun, and you're doing a great thing. This podcast, really, really good.
Thank you, Omid.